The sky above Pride Ring split open at precisely 600 hours, the way it always did during extermination season. Golden light poured through the rift like stage curtains parting for a performance no one in hell had bought tickets to see. The exorcists descended in formation, their wings cutting geometric patterns against the red haze that passed for atmosphere down here. They moved with the efficiency of a corporate audit team, which in many ways they were. Charlie Morningstar stood at the window of the Hazbin Hotel, watching the annual purge begin with the same nauseating familiarity one might feel watching a neighbor's house catch fire for the 5th time. Her fingers pressed against the glass, leaving small condensation marks, shaped like hope. Vaggie appeared at her shoulder spear, already in hand. Same routine, different body count. There has to be another way, Charlie said, though even she could hear how the words had worn thin from overuse. There is. It's called surviving until they leave. Vaggie's tone carried the practical weight of someone who had once worn the mask, now descending from Heaven's Gate. The exorcists spread across Pride Ring like a military operation disguised as divine judgment. They had quotas to meet territories to cover efficiency metrics that would make any middle manager proud. Heaven ran extermination the way corporations ran hostile takeovers, all paperwork and plausible deniability. Then the golden rift flickered, not the clean ceremonial flutter of angelic banners, but a genuine technical malfunction. Static rippled across the portal's edge like interference on a television screen, catching a signal it was never designed to receive. Several exorcists paused mid-descent, their formation breaking, as they looked back toward the source. A second tier opened beside Heaven's Gate. Not gold, but a sickly green that pulsed with the rhythm of corrupted data trying to handshake with a clean system. The rift was small at first, barely noticeable against the larger celestial architecture. But it widened with the inexorable patience of metal fatigue reaching critical failure. Something fell through. The figure plummeted past the exorcists without acknowledging their existence, dropping through hell's atmosphere like a meteor that had forgotten to burn. He hit the ground in Pride Ring's commercial district with an impact that shattered pavement and sent several lesser demons scrambling for cover. The Praetor suit absorbed the landing without comment, its armor scoring the concrete in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Doomslayer stood, assessed, moved. The nearest exorcist barely had time to register the threat before he closed the distance. His hand shot out, fingers wrapping around the shaft of her spear with the casual certainty of someone who had disarmed celestial beings before and found the experience underwhelming. He yanked the weapon free, reversed grip, and drove it through the next exorcist's chest plate before the first one finished falling. The angel's steel sang as it pierced divine armor. The exorcist collapsed and did not rise. Permanently, the formation broke. Exorcists wheeled in the air, abandoning their planned routes to converge on this new variable that had appeared in their carefully calculated purge. They descended with weapons drawn, their movements shifting from bureaucratic efficiency to something approaching actual concern. He met them on the ground, using their own spear with the same brutal economy he applied to everything. No flourishes, no wasted motion, just the mathematics of violence solved in the most direct way possible. When the second wave came at him from above, he simply waited until they committed to their attack vectors, then moved 6 inches to the left and let them impale themselves on their own momentum. At the Hazbin Hotel, Alastair materialized in the lobby with his perpetual grin stretched across his face like a wound that refused to heal. His eyes tracked the disturbance in the distance with the focus of a predator recognizing something that didn't fit the usual food chain. Well now, he said, his voice carrying that strange radiostatic quality that made every word sound like it was being broadcast from a decade no one remembered fondly. This is entertaining. Charlie tore her gaze from the window. People are dying out there. People are always dying out there, dear. That is rather the point of Extermination Day. What makes this occasion special is that some of them appear to be angels. Vaggie's grip tightened on her spear. That's not possible. And yet, Alastair gestured toward the window with his cane, the motion as theatrical as everything he did. Evidence suggests otherwise. The three of them watched as Doomslayer carved a path through the exorcist ranks with the methodical patience of someone clearing a particularly dense forest. He did not hurry, did not slow, simply continued the work with the same relentless forward momentum that had defined his existence across dimensions and conflicts that Hell's current residents could not begin to comprehend. An exorcist tried to flank him. He caught the movement, and his peripheral vision turned and used the attacker's own spear to pin them to a billboard advertising redemption through consumer products. The irony was lost on him entirely. "We should help," Charlie said. "Help which side?" Alastair's question hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one had thought to extinguish. "The side that's not trying to genocide us annually," Vaggie snapped. "Ah, but is the enemy of our enemy truly our friend, or simply a different category of threat?" Alastair tilted his head, his grin never wavering. "I find myself curious which option he represents." Doomslayer did not represent an option. He represented a conclusion. When the exorcists adapted their tactics and began attacking in coordinated strikes, he adapted faster. When they tried to use aerial superiority, he brought them down to his level. When they attempted to overwhelm him with numbers, he demonstrated that numbers were just a longer cue to the same inevitable end. The fighting spilled closer to the hotel. Debris from a collapsed building scattered across the street outside, and several sinners who had been attempting to wait out the extermination in the hotel's dubious shelter suddenly found themselves with front row seats to something unprecedented. An exorcist crashed through the hotel's front window, her armor cracked and leaking something that glowed too bright to be blood. She scrambled backward across the lobby floor, leaving smears of luminescence on the dated carpet Charlie had been meaning to replace. Doomslayer stepped through the ruined window frame. His visor tracked the angel, then swept across the lobby cataloging threats with the same dispassionate efficiency a butcher might use to assess cuts of meat. His gaze passed over Charlie Vaggie Alastair, the handful of sinners pressed against the far wall. No threat. He dismissed them from consideration. The exorcist tried to rise. He crossed the distance and ended the attempt with economical brutality, using his gauntleted fist because the spear had broken 3 encounters ago, and he had not bothered to acquire a replacement. The angel's light dimmed, flickered, died. Another permanent casualty in a war Heaven had assumed they were the only ones capable of waging. Charlie found her voice first. Wait. Doomslayer did not wait, did not acknowledge. Simply turned toward the broken window and the sounds of continued conflict outside. Please, Charlie said, stepping forward despite Vaggie's restraining hand on her shoulder. You don't have to keep killing them. He paused. For exactly 1 second he stopped moving. It was not consideration, not doubt. Simply the momentary recalculation required when an obstacle moved into his path. And he needed to determine whether it qualified as a target or merely an inconvenience. Charlie interpreted the pause as an opening. I'm Charlie Morningstar. This is the Hazbin Hotel. We're trying to rehabilitate sinners, to prove redemption is possible, to show that there's another way, besides all this violence and death. And he walked past her. Not around, not away. Past as though she were furniture that had been poorly arranged, but wasn't worth the effort to relocate. His boots left tracks of angel dust and concrete powder across the lobby floor. Vaggie pulled Charlie back. Let him go. But he's already gone. Doomslayer stepped back through the broken window into Pride Ring's commercial district, where roughly 24 exorcists had regrouped and were attempting to establish a perimeter. They saw him emerge, and their formation tightened reflexively the way soldiers brace when they realize the person they're fighting has no intention of retreating. The battle resumed with the same one-sided efficiency it had demonstrated since his arrival. Alastair laughed, the sound crackling with genuine amusement for the first time in several seasons. Oh, this is wonderful. Charlie, my dear, I do believe your hotel just became considerably more interesting. He's not a guest, Charlie said, though even she wasn't sure what he was. No. Alastair agreed, his eyes tracking the carnage outside with the focus of a connoisseur appreciating fine art. He's something much better. He's proof that the game can be changed. And I haven't seen Heaven's Pieces taken off the board so thoroughly since the first time someone tried it. Vaggie moved to the window, her tactical mind already processing implications. If he can kill them permanently, if those weapons can kill angels for good, then everything about extermination just shifted. Indeed. Alastair's grin widened to proportions that should have split his face. Hell has just received a very pointed lesson in asymmetric warfare. I wonder if the faculty upstairs are taking notes. Outside, Doomslayer finished clearing the immediate area. The exorcists, who could still fly, retreated to higher altitude, their formations tightening as they attempted to process this variable that had appeared without warning or precedent. He scanned the skyline. Combat had dispersed across a 6-block radius, exorcists regrouping at altitude while reassessing their operational doctrine. None remained in immediate engagement range. He began walking, not toward any specific landmark, just forward, following the same relentless trajectory that had carried him through dimensions and conflicts too numerous for Hell's current scribes to chronicle. He walked toward the hotel. Not to it, but toward it, following a trajectory that would take him past the entrance. Charlie made a decision that Vaggie would later categorize as either inspired or suicidal, depending on how the next few hours unfolded. She stepped outside into the street, still smoking from recent combat, and positioned herself directly in his path. "You need somewhere to rearm," she said, skipping past pleasantries, because she suspected they would be wasted. "Somewhere to plan your next move. Somewhere Heaven won't immediately find you." Doomslayer stopped. Not because of her words, but because she was standing in his path, and moving her would require a decision about whether she qualified as an obstacle or a target. "The hotel has rooms." Charlie continued, her voice carrying that same desperate optimism that had fueled every doomed social program in Hell's history. "Defensible positions, clear sight lines, and..." She gestured at the angel corpse still cooling in the lobby, apparently strategic value. His visor tracked the building's profile. Elevated position, multiple egress routes, stone construction thick enough to provide cover. The tactical value had already registered before she finished speaking. The structure would serve as a temporary fire base while he cataloged threats and identified the machinery behind the purge. He turned toward the entrance. Vaggie tensed. "Charlie, what are you doing? Offering sanctuary?" Charlie's voice carried the weight of someone who had built an entire philosophy on believing in second chances, even when those chances walked through your door, covered in the remains of beings who had never needed a second anything. Doomslayer walked into the Hazbin hotel. Not as a guest, not as an ally, simply as someone who had identified a defensible position and claimed it with the same brutal efficiency he applied to everything else. His visor swept corners, tracked sight lines, cataloged fields of fire and breach points with automatic precision. Alastair's laughter echoed through the lobby, crackling with static and genuine delight. "Welcome to the Hazbin Hotel, where we offer redemption, rehabilitation, and apparently tactical support for interdimensional warfare. I do hope you enjoy your stay." Doomslayer did not respond, did not acknowledge, simply continued his tactical sweep of the building visor, calculating firing angles and establishing primary exfiltration routes with the automatic competence of someone for whom every room was a potential battlefield. Charlie watched him disappear into the hotel's interior and felt the foundations of her carefully constructed philosophy begin to crack under the weight of a very simple question. What do you do when salvation arrives, wearing the face of extinction? Outside, the exorcists continued their purge, but their formations had changed, tightened, become more cautious. Heaven had just learned that their annual population control measure could be interrupted. Their soldiers could be killed. Their divine authority could be challenged by something that did not care about their celestial hierarchy. The sky above Pride Ring burned gold, and green where the two rifts still pulsed in uneasy proximity. Extermination Day continued, but the script had been rewritten by someone who had never read the original and would not have cared if he had. In the lobby of the Hazbin Hotel, Charlie Morningstar stood surrounded by angel dust and shattered glass, trying to reconcile her belief in redemption with the reality of a being who solved problems by removing them from existence. Vaggie moved beside her, spear still ready. "We need to fortify. If Heaven figures out he's here, they'll come for him. Then we protect him. Charlie, we don't even know what he is. I know what he isn't." Charlie turned from the window, her expression carrying a determination that had survived every failure and disappointment hell had thrown at her. He isn't standing by and watching people get slaughtered according to schedule. Alistair materialized between them, his presence announced by the faint scent of old radio static and newer blood. How delightfully naive. He isn't saving anyone, dear girl. He's simply fighting a war that happens to intersect with our interests. The enemy of our enemy is not our friend. He's just an enemy with better timing. Maybe, Charlie said. But maybe that's enough. The hotel settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that comes when violence takes a breath before resuming. Somewhere in the building's interior, Doomslayer had found a position and was preparing for whatever came next with the same methodical certainty he had applied to everything since falling through a rift that should never have opened. Hell had received an uninvited guest. Heaven had received a pointed reminder that their monopoly on divine violence was not as absolute as they had assumed. And Charlie Morningstar had made a choice to shelter something that might be salvation, or might be a different category of damnation entirely. Outside, Extermination Day continued its scheduled programming. Inside the Hazbin Hotel, the script had been thrown out entirely, and no one was quite sure what came next, but they would find out soon enough. The city burned in patterns both familiar and new. And somewhere in the distance, an exorcist commander was placing a call to Heaven's administrative offices to report a development that did not fit any existing protocol. The war had changed. The players had shifted. And in the lobby of a hotel built on the impossible dream of redemption, the angel's body still leaked light onto carpet that had seen worse stains, but never quite like this. Charlie looked at the corpse, then at the broken window, then at the hallway where their uninvited guest had disappeared. "We're going to need more rooms," she said, and despite everything, there was something almost like hope in her voice. Vaggie sighed. "We're going to need a completely different kind of hotel." But that, as it turned out, was exactly what hell was about to get. The hotel settled into a silence that felt less like peace and more like the moment between lightning and thunder. Vaggie stood in the center of the lobby, spear in hand, calculating angles the way a general might survey a battlefield that used to be farmland. The broken window let in cold air that smelled of ash and something metallic that might have been angel blood, or might have been the city's perpetual rot. Charlie knelt beside the exorcist corpse, her fingers hovering above the cooling armor without quite touching it. The light had stopped leaking. What remained looked less divine and more like evidence. "We need to move this," Vaggie said. "Her," Charlie corrected quietly. "We need to move her. It's a body now. Strategic liability." Vaggie's tone carried the flat pragmatism of someone who had learned to separate sentiment from survival long before she learned it was supposed to be difficult. If more come looking, we don't want proof of concept sitting in our entryway. From somewhere in this building's upper floors came the sound of metal on stone, deliberate and rhythmic. Doomslayer had found the maintenance access to the roof and was doing something that involved moving heavy objects. Neither of them needed to see it to know he was turning their architectural weaknesses into something more defensible. Alistair materialized near the bar, his presence announced by the faint crackle of radio static. He had been absent for the last 20 minutes, which meant he had been watching from somewhere they couldn't see. That was his particular talent, being simultaneously present and removed, like a critic who never bought a ticket, but always wrote the review. "Fascinating developments," he said, examining his claws with theatrical disinterest. "Our uninvited guest appears to be renovating. Without permission, I might add. Quite rude." "He's fortifying," Vaggie said. She moved to the broken window, assessing sight lines and approach vectors with muscle memory from a lifetime she had tried to forget. "Which means he expects them to come back. Which means we need to decide if we're defending this position or evacuating. We're not abandoning the hotel." Charlie stood brushing dust from her jacket. The gesture was automatic, like someone straightening a painting while the house burned around them. "This is supposed to be a sanctuary. Sanctuaries only work when both sides agree on the rules." Vaggie turned from the window. "Heaven just learned their soldiers can die. You think they're going to respect neutral ground now?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Charlie's philosophy had always required a certain amount of willful optimism, the kind that could look at hell's governance and see potential for reform. But potential required time, and time required not being flattened by whatever escalation heaven was currently planning. Husk emerged from the kitchen, bottle in hand, looking like he had aged another decade in the last hour. "Bars got structural damage. Back walls compromised. And before you ask, no, I don't know what did it, because I was hiding like a sensible person. The entire western exposure is vulnerable," Vaggie said, already moving into tactical mode. "Windows are single pane, no reinforcement. The lobby's a kill box if they breach from above. We need to help people," Charlie interrupted. "That's what this place is for, not turning it into a military installation. It's already a military installation." Vaggie's voice sharpened. "The moment he walked through that door, it became a target. We don't get to pretend otherwise, just because it's inconvenient for your philosophy." The words landed with the weight of truth that had been waiting for permission to be spoken. Charlie flinched, but didn't retreat, and the space between them filled with the kind of tension that comes when two people who love each other discover they're standing on opposite sides of a line neither knew existed. Alastor watched the exchange with obvious delight, his grin widening. "Oh, this is delicious. The eternal struggle between idealism and pragmatism performed live for my entertainment. Tell me, Charlie dear, how does one rehabilitate a soul while simultaneously preparing for siege warfare? We figure it out," Charlie said, though her voice carried less conviction than usual. "Or," Alastor continued, "you accept that redemption is a lovely theory that works beautifully right up until someone drops a war on your doorstep." He gestured toward the ceiling where the sounds of construction had shifted to something that might have been furniture being repurposed into barricades. "Your guest understands this. He's not concerned with moral frameworks. He simply identifies problems and removes them. That's not how we do things here. Perhaps not how you did things." Alastor's tone softened to something almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "But circumstances do have a way of editing our principles, don't they?" Vaggie moved between them, cutting off whatever Charlie was about to say. "Debate later. Survive now." She pointed to Husk. "Bar gets boarded up. Use whatever's in storage." Then to Angel Dust, who had been lurking near the stairs trying to look uninvolved. "You're tall and obnoxious. Help him." "I'm also fragile and expensive." Angel protested, but he was already moving toward the storage closet. "Charlie," Vaggie's voice dropped to something more private. "I need you to make a decision. Are we holding this position, or aren't we?" Charlie looked at the lobby, at the broken window, and the bloodstains, and the hotel she had built on the premise that everyone deserved a second chance. The philosophy had never included a clause about what happened when heaven's first chance involved annual genocide and your building suddenly housed something they couldn't kill with standard operating procedures. "We hold," she said finally, but we're not becoming them. We're becoming what we need to be to survive them. Vaggi's correction was gentle, but immovable. There's a difference. From the second floor came a crash, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across hardwood. Doomslayer had found the furniture in the unused guest rooms and was apparently redistributing it according to strategic principles that had nothing to do with interior design and everything to do with creating choke points. Vaggi headed for the stairs. I'm going to see what he's doing. Maybe learn something useful. He's not a teacher, Alastair called after her. He's a natural disaster with tactical awareness. Then I'll learn from the disaster. Charlie watched her go, then turned to find Alastair studying her with that unblinking attention he usually reserved for people about to make catastrophic decisions. What? I'm simply observing, he said. You're about to have a crisis of conscience, and I want to make sure I have a good seat for it. I'm not. But the protest died because they both knew it was coming. The collision between what the hotel was supposed to represent and what it was becoming had been inevitable from the moment Doomslayer walked through the door. Charlie had just been hoping to delay the impact a little longer. On the second floor, Vaggi found him in one of the guest rooms. He had stripped the bed frame and was using the metal supports to reinforce the window, creating a lattice that would allow vision but restrict entry. The mattress had been repurposed as a barricade for the hallway, positioned to funnel any breach into a narrower kill zone. You've done this before, she said, not really a question. He didn't acknowledge her presence. Simply continued working with the methodical efficiency of someone who had fortified more positions than she had years of existence. Vaggi studied the modifications, cataloging the logic behind each choice. You're creating overlapping fields of fire, making them commit to narrow approach vectors. She paused. You're not defending the hotel. You're turning it into a weapon. His visor tracked her for 1 second, long enough to classify her as non-threat, then returned to the window reinforcement. I was an exorcist, she said, though she didn't know why she was telling him. I know how they think. They'll probe for weaknesses first, test our response time, then commit when they think they've found a gap. If he cared about her tactical analysis, he gave no indication. The window lattice locked into place with brutal finality. Vaggi watched him work for another moment, then made a decision that would have horrified her 6 months ago. The western wall's vulnerable. Kitchen access. If they breach there, we lose the ground floor. She wasn't asking for help. Wasn't even sure he was listening. But she was sharing intelligence with something that killed angels efficiently. And that fact alone represented a philosophical journey she hadn't realized she was taking. Doomslayer moved past her, heading for the stairs. Not toward the kitchen, but up to the 3rd floor where the roof access waited. Whatever defensive logic he was following didn't require her input, didn't need her intel, and absolutely would not adjust for her comfort level with the moral implications. Downstairs, Charlie was helping Husk board up the bar's back wall when the first probe came. Not a full assault, just 3 exorcists doing reconnaissance testing. Whether the hotel was still occupied or if the anomaly had moved on to terrorize other sectors of Pride Ring. They circled the building at a distance that suggested caution, their flight patterns careful and measured. One peeled off to check the roof. She never made it. The sound was brief and final, metal meeting flesh, meeting stone. By the time the other 2 exorcists reacted, their companion was falling with the kind of momentum that comes from being thrown rather than choosing to descend. The remaining 2 retreated immediately, not even attempting to recover their fellow soldier. Strategic withdrawal based on insufficient data and unacceptable casualty projections. Heaven's bureaucracy might move slowly, but Heaven's soldiers knew when to report problems to management. In the lobby, everyone had frozen at the sound. Charlie stared at the ceiling as if she could see through the floors to where something had just happened that proved her hotel was now officially part of the war. They'll come back, Vaggi said quietly, with more. With better preparation. I know. And when they do, he's going to kill them. Here. In your hotel. The place you built for redemption. "I know," Charlie repeated, and the words tasted like surrender. Alastair's laughter drifted through the lobby, soft and satisfied. "Welcome to the occupation, my dear. I do hope you've prepared appropriate accommodations for your resident war machine." Night fell over Pride Ring, which meant the red sky darkened to a deeper shade of crimson, and the city's ambient screaming took on a more desperate quality. In the Hazbin Hotel, furniture had migrated to strategic positions, windows bore improvised reinforcements, and the lobby smelled less like hope and more like a forward operating base. Somewhere on the roof, Doomslayer continued his work. The sounds had become familiar enough that they blended into the background, just another part of the hotel's new normal. The sound of salvation or damnation, or perhaps just the sound of something that didn't care about the distinction. Charlie sat in what used to be the reading nook and was now a defensive position with good sight lines to both entrances. She held a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the wall, where she had hung a sign that read, "Every sinner has a future." The sign was still there, but the future it promised was looking significantly more complicated than she had planned. Vaggie found her there as the hour approached midnight. Sat down without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders touched. "We're going to survive this," Vaggie said. "At what cost?" The question didn't have an answer, or maybe it had too many answers, none of them comfortable. They sat in silence, listening to the distant sounds of hell, adjusting to the new reality, where extermination could be interrupted and angels could die, and a hotel built on impossible dreams had become something that resembled a fortress. Outside, an exorcist patrol passed at high altitude, their formations tighter than they had been this morning. They didn't come close, didn't test the perimeter, simply acknowledged that the Hazbin Hotel had been reclassified from irrelevant redemption project to active threat zone, and adjusted their flight plans accordingly. On the roof, Doomslayer finished the final reinforcement. The hotel was now as defensible as it was going to get without proper military equipment. Not perfect, not impenetrable, but sufficient to turn an assault into a costly proposition that would require Heaven to commit resources they might not want to spend on a single building. He didn't care about the hotel's philosophical mission. Didn't care about redemption or reformation or any of the other abstractions that Hell's residents used to pretend their eternal punishment might have a statute of limitations. He had identified a position with tactical value and claimed it. The fact that it happened to be someone's dream made no difference to the mathematics of defensive warfare. Below him, Charlie finally set down the cold tea and made peace with a truth she had been avoiding since the moment he walked through her door. Sometimes salvation came from angels with harps and mercy. Sometimes it came from something that didn't believe in either. And sometimes you didn't get to choose which one showed up when you needed help. The hotel stood through the night fortified and waiting no longer. Quite the sanctuary it had been that morning, but not yet the battlefield it would become. The transition was happening in real time. One boarded window and repositioned mattress at a time, and Charlie Morningstar was learning what every idealist eventually learns when theory meets practice. In the most unforgiving classroom imaginable, the lesson hurt. But it kept her alive. And in the occupation that had begun when an uninvited guest fell through a rift and claimed her lobby as a fire base, staying alive was the first prerequisite to everything else she hoped to achieve. Even redemption required survival. She was just beginning to understand what survival actually cost. The morning after brought no sunlight. Only a different quality of darkness. Hell's sky refused to acknowledge day or night in any meaningful way. But the clock insisted it was 700 hours, and the hotel's remaining windows showed pride rings settling into the exhausted quiet that followed violence the way hangovers followed poor decisions. Charlie stood in the reinforced lobby staring at 3 angelic spears propped against the wall, like evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet. Doomslayer had left them there sometime during the night, placed with the same casual indifference someone might show toward empty bottles. They gleamed with a light that didn't belong in hell clean and accusatory. Vaggie appeared beside her, coffee in hand, looking like she hadn't slept, but had at least made peace with insomnia. We need to talk about those. I know. I mean, really talk. Not the version where you hope they disappear if you avoid eye contact long enough. Charlie reached out, fingers stopping an inch from the nearest spear. The metal hummed with something that might have been divine resonance, or might have been her imagination trying to assign meaning to tools designed for permanent solutions. If we keep them. When we keep them, Vaggie corrected. Heaven's not going to stop. You saw the patrol patterns last night. They're regrouping, not retreating. When we keep them, what does that make us? The question didn't have an answer that fit comfortably in Charlie's philosophy, which had always worked better in theory than in lobbies that smelled like angel dust and tactical compromise. Vaggie set down her coffee and picked up one of the spears, testing its weight, with the practiced ease of someone who had carried similar weapons in a previous life. It makes us armed, she said. Everything else is just commentary. Alastair emerged from the shadows near the staircase, because of course he did. His timing was always impeccable when someone was having a moral crisis worth witnessing. Ah, the eternal question. To arm or not to arm? Though I believe the answer walked through your door 2 days ago and has been making renovations ever since. This isn't a joke, Charlie said. No, it's tragedy, which is significantly more entertaining. He examined the spears with the detached interest of a museum curator. Angelic steel, quite rare, quite permanent. One wonders where one might acquire more, given that your resident catastrophe seems to have exhausted the local supply. Vaggie's expression shifted to something harder. Carmilla. The name hung in the air like a price tag no one wanted to read. Carmilla Carmine, overlord, an arms dealer. The person who had built an empire on the intersection of heaven's violence and hell's survival instinct. If anyone understood the market value of permanent death, it would be her. Charlie felt something inside her stomach drop. No, we're not going to her. She's already in the business, Vaggie said. Exorcists leave weapons behind every purge. Carmilla's been collecting and redistributing them for years. It's not like we'd be starting something new. We'd be participating in it. We're already participating. The moment we let him stay here, the moment we didn't throw those spears out the window, we became part of the infrastructure. Vaggie's voice carried the weight of someone who had already done this calculation and didn't like the answer, but accepted it anyway. The only question is whether we participate smart or participate stupid. From somewhere above came the familiar sound of metal being repositioned. Doomslayer, still working, still fortifying, still operating according to logic that had nothing to do with their philosophical debate and everything to do with converting the hotel into something that could withstand whatever heaven decided constituted an appropriate response. Charlie closed her eyes, opened them. The spears were still there. If we do this, we're acknowledging that redemption isn't enough. That survival requires being alive long enough to attempt redemption, Vaggie interrupted. You can't rehabilitate corpses. It was a terrible argument. It was also correct. Charlie hated that most of all. 3 hours later, they stood outside Carmine Industries in a district of Pride Ring that catered to clientele who preferred their business conducted with minimal small talk and maximum discretion. The building looked like a ballet studio had merged with a munitions depot, all clean lines and reinforced architecture. Vaggie knocked. The door opened immediately, as if they had been expected. Carmilla Carmine sat at a desk that looked designed for signing contracts that people later regretted, her posture impeccable, her expression carrying the professional neutrality of someone who sold necessities to desperate people and felt neither pride nor shame about it. 2 figures stood behind her daughters, perhaps their presence more decorative than protective. Miss Morningstar, Carmilla said, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English from textbooks written by people who had never heard it spoken. How unexpected, and yet perhaps not. Charlie tried to find words that didn't taste like surrender. Failed. settled for directness. You deal in angelic weapons. I deal in survival tools. Heaven provides the raw materials annually. I merely redistribute them to those who understand the value of not being exterminated. Carmilla's eyes tracked to Vaggie. Former exorcist. I recognize the stance. You know what these weapons mean. I know what they cost, Vaggie said. Then you know I don't discuss prices with those who cannot afford the moral down payment. Carmilla stood, moving to a cabinet that opened to reveal a collection that would have made Heaven's armory look understocked. Spears, blades, fragments of armor, all glowing with that same accusatory light. Extermination leaves debris. Hell's scavengers collect. I refine. It's an economy older than your hotel's optimistic mission statement. Charlie forced herself to look at the weapons instead of away from them. We need to know how they work, why they're permanent, because Heaven designed them that way. Carmilla selected a spear, holding it with the casualness of someone who had long since made peace with what it represented. Angelic steel carries divine resonance. When it kills, it doesn't just end existence, it erases the potential for return. No respawn, no reformation, just conclusion. She set the spear down. It's the only weapon that works on both sides of the metaphysical divide. Angels die from it just as permanently as demons do. And you sell this, Charlie said, not quite a question. I provide options. What you choose to do with those options is your burden to carry, not mine. Carmilla returned to her desk. Though I suspect you didn't come here for philosophy. You came because someone fell through a rift and demonstrated that Heaven's monopoly on permanent violence was negotiable. Vaggie stepped forward. We need weapons, enough to defend a position. Training would help too, but mainly the weapons. Training I can provide, for a price. Carmilla's gaze shifted to Charlie. But what I'm curious about is whether you can afford what this transaction really costs. Not in currency. In the story you tell yourself about who you are. The question landed like a diagnosis. Charlie felt every principle she had built her hotel on, pressing against the reality of the situation. The hotel wasn't going to survive on good intentions. Heaven wasn't going to stop because she believed in redemption. And somewhere above them, Doomslayer was preparing for a war that didn't care about her philosophy. I can afford it, Charlie said, and the words felt like signing something in blood. Carmilla smiled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was the expression of someone watching a transaction complete exactly as expected. Then we have an arrangement. She gestured to her daughters. Odette will handle inventory. Clara will schedule training sessions. As for payment, we can discuss terms that don't involve currency you don't possess. What kind of terms? Vaggie's hand moved closer to her spear. Information, access, the occasional favor that aligns with mutual interests. Carmilla's tone suggested this was routine, which somehow made it worse. You're housing something unprecedented. That has value. I prefer to maintain relationships with entities that possess value. Charlie wanted to object. Wanted to argue that they weren't commodities to be traded. But Carmilla was right. They had become valuable the moment Doomslayer claimed their lobby, and value in Hell's economy meant leverage, which meant survival, which meant compromising every ideal she had walked into this office, still believing in. Fine, she said. Excellent. Carmilla made a note in a ledger that looked far too organized for an arms dealer. I'll have an initial shipment delivered tonight. Spears primarily, some blade work. Enough to outfit your associates. She paused. Though I suspect your primary asset doesn't require my assistance. He seems to have adopted a rather direct approach to acquisition. The meeting concluded with handshakes that felt like shackles and paperwork that read like confessions. By the time Charlie and Vaggie stepped back into Pride Ring's polluted air, the sky had darkened to its evening shade of crimson, and the deal was done. They walked in silence for several blocks before Vaggie spoke. "You did the right thing." "Did I?" "You did the thing that keeps people alive. Sometimes that's the same as right. Sometimes it isn't." Vaggie's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had already walked this path and knew the destination wasn't pleasant. Either way, we survived long enough to figure out which one it was. Back at the hotel, Doomslayer had completed another round of modifications. The second-floor windows now featured reinforced lattices that would funnel any breach into predictable kill zones. The stairwells had been narrowed with furniture repositioned according to principles that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with creating advantageous firing positions. He was in the third-floor hallway when they returned, checking sightlines, calculating angles. Charlie watched him work for a moment, then set down the contract Carmilla had given her on a table that had been repurposed into a barricade. "We got weapons from them some son. Son," she said to the air, because speaking directly to him still felt like addressing a natural disaster. "Enough to arm everyone who's staying. Enough to make heaven reconsider whether this building is worth the casualties." Doomslayer didn't acknowledge her words. Didn't need to. The hotel was already being transformed, according to his calculations, and whether Hell's residents chose to arm themselves was irrelevant to the mathematics of defensive warfare. He would continue his work regardless of their moral debates. Charlie returned to the lobby to find Alastair examining the contract with obvious amusement. "How delightful. You've just signed Hell's first defense appropriations bill. I do hope you've considered the precedent this sets." "I've considered survival," Charlie said. "Everything else is just noise." Spoken like a true politician. Alastair's grin widened. "You're learning, my dear. Slowly, painfully, but learning nonetheless." That night, Carmilla's delivery arrived in unmarked crates that clinked with the sound of permanent solutions. Vaggie oversaw the distribution, cataloging each weapon with military precision. Angel Dust picked up a blade and immediately put it down when he realized what it meant. Husk took a spear with the resignation of someone who had seen too many wars to be surprised by another one. Charlie sat in her office staring at paperwork that documented the hotel's transformation from redemption center to armed compound. The numbers made sense. The strategy made sense. The whole terrible transaction made perfect sense when you accepted that survival required compromising every principle you started with. She signed the final document, filed it away, went downstairs to find Vaggie instructing the staff on proper weapon maintenance with the clinical detachment of someone who had done this before and would do it again. Somewhere on the roof, Doomslayer continued his work. The sounds had become so familiar, they blended into the background, just another part of the hotel's new normal. The sound of preparation, of fortification, of something that understood war better than Hell ever would. And in the lobby, angelic weapons gleamed in racks that had been hastily assembled, waiting for hands that would use them not for redemption, but for the brutal mathematics of staying alive long enough to remember what redemption meant. Charlie looked at the arsenal and felt something inside her break quietly. Not dramatically, just the small, inevitable fracture that comes when theory meets practice and practice wins. The hotel had changed. She had changed. Hell would change next. The war was no longer coming. It was here, armed and waiting to see who could afford the cost of survival when the bill came due in principles instead of currency. She could afford it. She just wasn't sure she could afford what she would become after paying it. But that was tomorrow's crisis. Tonight they had weapons. Tonight they had a chance. Whether that chance was worth the price remained to be seen. The screens came first, always the screens. Vox's face materialized across every display in Pride Ring, simultaneously his grin electric and perfectly calibrated for maximum engagement. Behind him, carefully edited footage showed angelic bodies falling divine armor, cracking heaven's soldiers retreating in formations that looked less like strategic withdrawal and more like panic captured in high definition. Hell's citizens, Vox began, his voice modulated to hit every frequency between authority and entertainment, have witnessed something unprecedented. Heaven's annual purge has been interrupted. Their soldiers are dying, and the entity responsible is currently residing at... He paused for effect because everything Vox did involved timing. The Hazbin Hotel. In the hotel's lobby, Charlie watched the broadcast with mounting horror. Her hotel, her philosophy, her desperate attempt at redemption, now packaged and sold as content for an audience that confused spectacle with substance. Vaggie killed the feed. They're making us a target. They're making us a story. Alastair corrected, appearing near the staircase with his usual impeccable timing. There's a difference, though. I suspect you're about to learn it firsthand. Velveta's channel went live. 30 seconds later, her aesthetic perfectly curated for the Pride Ring demographic that consumed tragedy like fashion trends. She stood against a backdrop of coordinated chaos surrounded by screens showing different angles of the previous day's combat. Let's talk about branding. Heaven's had a monopoly on divine violence for what, centuries, and now some random drop-in flips the script. That's not just news, darlings. That's a movement. Valentino's feed launched moments after because the V's operated like a machine designed to saturate every demographic simultaneously. His broadcast came with different production values targeting a different audience. But the message remained consistent. The status quo had been challenged, content was being generated, and viewership numbers were about to justify some very expensive advertising rates. In the media district, the V's convened in their tower with the satisfied efficiency of people who had just identified a market opportunity and were already calculating profit margins. The room hummed with displays showing real-time analytics engagement metrics and the kind of data that Hell's corporations used to convert suffering into shareholder value. "We need to own this narrative," Vox said, fingers dancing across screens that responded to his touch like extensions of his nervous system. The hotel's the focal point. Charlie's the face. The anomaly is the draw. We package it right, we're looking at sustainable content generation for at least 2 quarters. Fashion angle, Velvet added scrolling through image captures. Apocalypse chic. We can move product on the back of this. Valentino exhaled smoke that formed shapes in the air, contracts. Written in vapor that dissipated before anyone could read the fine print. I want exclusivity. If anyone's selling the story, it's us. No freelance coverage, no independent feeds. They were so focused on the content that they missed the actual story unfolding 3 blocks away. Doomslayer had identified the towers as infrastructure. Not opponents, not threats. Just machinery that served a function. And that function interfered with the war against heaven by broadcasting tactical information that enemy intelligence could exploit. The solution was straightforward. He entered the media district the way natural disasters enter populated areas without announcement or apology. The first tower went dark when he severed its primary relay, a junction point that carried every signal Vox's empire broadcast across Pride Ring. The cut was precise, economical, and created a silence that felt deafening after years of constant noise. In the V's headquarters, alarms screamed. Not metaphorically. Actual alarms, the kind installed by people who understood that their entire business model depended on infrastructure that could fail. What the hell? Vox's image flickered across his own screens, a brief moment of genuine confusion, before corporate training reasserted control. Reroute through backup relays. Get me visual on Sector 7. The cameras caught him mid-approach to the second tower. Footage showed a figure in armor that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, moving through Hell's neon landscape like a void in the visual noise. He didn't pause to acknowledge the cameras. Didn't adjust his trajectory to avoid being filmed. simply continued toward the next objective with the same relentless forward momentum that had defined every action since his arrival. "Get that," Velvet said, already composing the social media post in her head. "We need that. Limited run, exclusive angle, drop it in." The second tower collapsed. Not explosively. Just structurally support beams, severed at load-bearing points, the entire edifice folding in on itself, with the inevitability of mathematics applied to architecture. Cameras caught the destruction from 17 angles before they too went offline. Valentino stood smoke-forgotten. He's not making content. He's destroying infrastructure. "Then we pivot," Vox said, though his voice had acquired an edge that suggested the pivot hadn't been planned. "Make him the villain. Position heaven as the..." The third tower went dark. Then the fourth. Each one taken offline with the same brutal efficiency, not through combat, but through systematic dismantling of the machinery that allowed the Vs to exist. Servers, relay stations, the physical architecture of media control removed from operation faster than backup systems could compensate. At the Hazbin Hotel, Charlie watched the feeds die one by one, replaced by static that somehow felt more honest than the programming it interrupted. "He's shutting them down. He's removing a distraction," Vaggie corrected. Heaven was watching those feeds, learning our patterns, adjusting their tactics based on real-time intelligence that the Vs were broadcasting for profit. Alastair laughed, the sound crackling with genuine appreciation. "Oh, this is delicious. The Vs built their empire on controlling narrative, and now they've encountered something that doesn't participate in stories. It's like watching a critic realize the play was never about them." In the media district, Doomslayer approached the central tower, the V's headquarters, the beating heart of Hell's information infrastructure. The building itself was a monument to ego and efficiency, all glass and steel and broadcast equipment, worth more than several souls combined. Vox appeared on every remaining screen in Pride Ring, his composure fracturing at the edges. Citizens of Hell were experiencing technical difficulties due to the central tower's foundation cracked. Not from explosive force, but from structural compromise applied to critical support points. Doomslayer had entered the building's sublevels and was methodically removing the architecture that kept several hundred tons of technology suspended in the air. Inside, the Vs finally understood they weren't dealing with someone who could be bought, threatened, or converted into profitable content. They were dealing with someone who had identified their entire existence as a problem and was solving it with the same mechanical certainty he applied to everything. "Evacuate," Valentino said, abandoning his usual affected calm. "We can still..." Velvet started. "Evacuate now." They fled through executive exits while the tower groaned around them, metal screaming as load distribution failed and gravity began collecting on structural debts that had been deferred through engineering. The Vs emerged onto Pride Ring streets in time to watch their empire literally collapse, the central tower folding in on itself in a cascade of failure that started at the foundation and propagated upward. Doomslayer emerged from the wreckage 30 seconds later, covered in concrete dust, but otherwise unaffected. In his hand, he carried something that glowed with angelic light. A weapon salvaged from the V's private collection, because of course they had been hoarding permanent solutions for their own protection. He turned toward the V's. For 3 seconds, the most powerful media moguls in Hell stood face to face with something that didn't care about their influence, their connections, or their carefully curated brands. Vox tried diplomacy. "Listen, we can negotiate." Doomslayer raised the angelic blade. Vox's screen face shattered. Not killed, not yet, but his primary manifestation destroyed, leaving him a disembodied consciousness, scrambling for backup servers that were currently buried under several floors of collapsed infrastructure. Valentino reached for a weapon he'd commissioned from Carmilla months ago. Angelic steel he'd kept as insurance. He was fast, experienced, had killed his share of enemies who underestimated what Hell's overlords were capable of. He wasn't fast enough. The blade went through his chest with the same economical brutality Doomslayer applied to everything. Valentino's eyes widened in genuine surprise, the kind reserved for people who encounter consequences they thought money could prevent. He collapsed and did not rise. Permanently. Velvet ran, smart enough to recognize when branding couldn't save you. She made it 3 blocks before Heaven's surveillance drones caught the footage and transmitted it to every remaining screen in Pride Ring. The message was clear. Hell had just lost one of its power structures. Not through political maneuvering or corporate takeover, but through simple direct removal of the people who maintained it. Back at the hotel, the screens flickered with fragmented feeds, showing the aftermath. Pride Ring's information network had been decapitated. Its central processing removed its narrative control, dismantled in less than an hour. Charlie stared at the static, feeling something between relief and horror. They were using us, making profit off people dying. And now they're not, Vaggie said. Because someone who doesn't understand profit margins removed them from the equation. Alastor studied the dead feeds with the fascination of someone watching a fundamental rule of hell get rewritten in real time. The V's built their power on controlling what people saw, on shaping the story, and he just demonstrated that you can't shape what refuses to be narrated. Doomslayer returned to the hotel as night fell, carrying additional angelic weapons that would be distributed to those who understood their weight. He didn't announce his return, didn't seek approval or acknowledgement. Simply resumed his work fortifying positions and calculating angles for battles that were coming whether hell was ready or not. The silence across Pride Ring felt profound. No broadcasts, no advertisements, no carefully curated feeds telling people what to think about the war developing around them. Just the raw reality of a conflict that had escalated beyond media's ability to package it. In Heaven's administrative offices, Sarah reviewed the footage from surveillance drones with the kind of cold calculation that came from realizing a problem had just grown exponentially larger. The entity they had dismissed as a tactical anomaly had just decapitated one of Hell's power structures and demonstrated a willingness to use their own weapons against them. Escalation protocols, she said to the assembled seraphim. This is no longer a purge disruption. This is war. At the Hazbin hotel, Charlie watched the dead screens and tried to reconcile what she felt about the V's destruction. They had been parasites, exploiters, everything wrong with Hell's corporate culture. But they had also been people, and now one of them was permanently gone. We didn't ask for this, she said quietly. No, Vaggie agreed, but we're the ones who have to live with it. Alastor materialized beside them, his grin carrying something that might have been genuine respect. Hell just learned a valuable lesson about the difference between controlling the narrative and controlling reality. Unfortunately for the V's, they learned it too late. The night settled over Pride Ring in unusual quiet. No advertisements, no propaganda, no carefully crafted messages telling demons what to think or feel or buy. Just silence, and in that silence the sound of Heaven adjusting tactics and Hell, realizing that the war had moved beyond anyone's ability to spin it into comfortable lies. The Hazbin Hotel stood fortified and armed, no longer a symbol of redemption, but a fortress in a conflict that was about to escalate beyond anything Pride Ring had experienced in its documented history. And somewhere in the building's interior, Doomslayer continued his work unconcerned with the political implications, the narrative shifts, or the fact that Hell had just lost its ability to lie to itself about what was coming. He had removed an obstacle. The work continued. Everything else was just noise. The silence left by the V's collapse lasted 3 days. Long enough for Pride Ring to realize how much noise it had been living with, how much distraction had been mistaken for normalcy. Without the constant feed, without the curated panic and manufactured outrage, Hell's residents were left with something far more uncomfortable than chaos. Reality. Vaggie stood at the hotel's reinforced window, watching exorcist patrols circle at altitude they hadn't descended from since the first encounter. The formations had changed. Tighter, more cautious. The kind of tactical adjustment that came from command recognizing they were no longer hunting, but being hunted. "They're waiting," she said. Charlie joined her, carrying coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "For what? For us to make the next move? Or for orders that justify escalation beyond standard purge protocols?" Vaggie gestured at the patrols. "They're not here to kill sinners anymore. They're here to contain a problem that doesn't fit their operational doctrine." In the lobby below, Carmilla's latest delivery sat in organized rows. Spears, blades, armor fragments, all glowing with that same accusatory light. The staff had been training for 2 days, under Vaggie's instruction, learning the difference between fighting for survival and fighting for permanent conclusions. The lessons were uncomfortable. The weapons were worse. Alastor materialized near the staircase, his presence announced by static that felt thinner than usual, like even he was being worn down by the weight of implication. Fascinating how quiet hell becomes when it loses its voice. Almost philosophical, almost peaceful, almost like we're trapped, Charlie said. The word hung in the air heavier than she'd intended. Alastor's grin widened, but his eyes carried something that might have been genuine interest. Trapped. What an intriguing choice of phrasing. Vaggie turned from the window. "What are you getting at?" "Nothing sinister. Simply observation." Alastor gestured toward the city with his cane. "Pride Ring has always had a certain architectural quality, hasn't it? Convenient for heaven to manage, all the sinners in one location, easily accessible for annual maintenance." Charlie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're saying it's intentional." "I'm saying heaven doesn't make mistakes. They make systems." Alastor's voice carried the tone of someone explaining an obvious truth. And Pride Ring is the most efficient system ever designed for processing souls that refuse to stay dead. On the roof, Doomslayer had stopped his fortification work. Not because the hotel was complete, but because he had encountered something that registered differently than stone and steel. The edge of Pride Ring, where reality bent in ways that suggested boundaries existed beyond the physical. He stood at the perimeter visor, tracking patterns in the air that shouldn't have been visible. Containment architecture, not walls. Something more fundamental, a framework that defined the space and everything in it. He reached out. His gauntleted hand passed through empty air and met resistance that felt like touching a signature written in laws older than Hell's current administration. The barrier didn't stop him, but it registered his presence, cataloged it, sent telemetry somewhere that would process the information according to protocols designed by entities that built prisons disguised as punishment. Heaven's infrastructure responded immediately, not with force, but with recognition. Systems designed to track and contain had just detected something outside their classification parameters. In Heaven's administrative complex, alarms manifested as gentle chimes that translated into urgent priority flags across Sarah's workspace. She examined the data with the clinical precision of someone who had spent millennia managing containment protocols. "Unauthorized contact with Pride Ring barrier," the report read. "Entity classification unknown. Angelic signature present but unregistered. Threat assessment pending." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her wings shifted in a way that suggested discomfort. He's testing the cage. Below in Pride Ring streets, Charlie had left the hotel against Vaggie's better judgment, following instinct toward the edge of territory she had lived in her entire existence, without questioning its boundaries. She found herself in a district that felt thinner somehow, like the architecture was stretching to cover space it shouldn't occupy. The barrier was invisible until you looked at it correctly. Then it was impossible to miss. A membrane of divine engineering, thin as prayer and strong as law. defining the exact parameters of where Pride Ring ended and something else began. She pressed her hand against it. The surface felt cold, sterile, like touching the philosophical concept of limitation made manifest. On the other side, she could see the next ring so close, she could almost reach it if the universe acknowledged her right to be there. It didn't. "How long have you known?" she asked the air, though Alastor materialized beside her as if summoned by the question itself. "That we're in a cage." His grin carried no humor. "Always, dear girl. The question was never whether hell is contained. The question is why none of us tried very hard to leave. Because we can't. Because we accepted that we shouldn't." Alastor tapped the barrier with his cane. It rippled like disturbed water, then settled back into immobility. Heaven doesn't need locks that keep us in. They need mechanisms that make us believe we belong here. Vaggie arrived with her spear, looking between Charlie and the barrier with growing understanding. This is what they meant by Pride Ring containment. Not prison, classification. Indexed, Alastor agreed. Cataloged, filed under problematic souls requiring regular maintenance. Very efficient, very permanent. Charlie felt something inside her fracture that had been cracking since Doomslayer walked through her door. "Redemption can't exist in a filing cabinet." "No," Alastor said softly. "It cannot." They returned to the hotel to find Doomslayer descended from the roof, standing in the lobby, with a stillness that suggested calculation. His visor tracked Charlie's entrance, registered her presence, then returned to examining the angelic weapons Carmilla had delivered. He selected one, a blade clean and simple, carrying enough divine resonance to register against containment architecture designed to respond to Heaven's authority. He tested its weight, found it acceptable, and moved toward the door. "Where are you going?" Charlie asked, though she suspected she knew. He didn't answer. Simply continued toward the edge of Pride Ring, toward the barrier that defined Hell's boundaries and Heaven's control. Vaggie grabbed Charlie's arm. "If he breaks that barrier..." "He won't break it," Charlie said with certainty she didn't fully understand. "He'll test it. Make Heaven acknowledge it exists." They followed at a distance, watching as Doomslayer approached the barrier with the same methodical patience he applied to everything. When he reached the membrane, he didn't strike it with force. Instead, he pressed the angelic blade against the surface and simply held it there. The barrier recognized the signature. Divine authorization properly encoded, carried by an entity that shouldn't exist in Hell's classification system. The framework attempted to process the contradiction, running through protocols designed to handle authorized entry. It found no category for authorized entity requesting egress from containment. The system stuttered. Not broke. Just hesitated, caught between conflicting instructions. For 3 seconds, the barrier's integrity wavered, showing seams in the architecture that had been invisible moments before. Not a door. Just the outline of where a door could theoretically exist if someone had the correct authorization and understood how containment was constructed. Then the moment passed. The barrier reasserted itself stronger than before as Heaven's systems adapted to account for the anomaly. But the message had been sent, received, acknowledged. In Heaven's administrative complex, Sarah stared at telemetry that should have been impossible. An entity in Pride Ring had just demonstrated knowledge of containment architecture and possessed the means to potentially compromise it, not through force, but through exploiting the authorization systems Heaven relied on to maintain order. "This isn't a tactical problem anymore," she said to the assembled seraphim. "This is a structural threat. If he understands the framework..." "He doesn't understand it," another voice interrupted. "He's testing it. Like someone who doesn't know how a lock works, but has found the keyhole." "That's worse," Sarah said. "Understanding can be countered. Blind experimentation is unpredictable." Back at the hotel, Charlie sat in her office, staring at documentation she had accumulated over years of trying to understand Hell's governance. Maps, regulations, divine law transcripts. all of it suddenly legible in a new way, the cage visible in every clause that defined where sinners could exist and what happened when they tried to leave. Vaggie found her there, as evening darkened, pride rings perpetual crimson to something deeper. You're thinking about it. About what? Breaking out. Actually trying to leave Pride Ring. Using him as the key. Charlie didn't deny it. If the cage can be tested, it can be understood. If it can be understood, it can be broken, Vaggie finished. And then we're at war. Not purge disruption, not tactical resistance. Actual war with Heaven's full infrastructure, because we'll have proven we can compromise their containment systems. Is that worse than staying in a cage forever? The question had no comfortable answer. Vaggie sat down, exhaustion finally catching up with someone who had been fighting in one form or another for longer than she wanted to remember. I don't know. But I know once we cross that line, we don't get to pretend we're just defending ourselves anymore. Alastor appeared in the doorway, his timing perfect as always. Quite the philosophical dilemma. Freedom versus safety. Progress versus preservation. The eternal struggle between wanting to escape and being terrified of what lies beyond the bars. You're enjoying this, Charlie accused. I'm appreciating it, Alistair corrected. There's a difference. Hell has been static for so long we forgot that stagnation was a choice, not an inevitability. Your guest is reminding us that systems only work when those trapped inside them believe there's no alternative. Charlie looked at the maps, the regulations, the carefully constructed architecture of eternal punishment disguised as justice. Then she looked at Vaggie, at Alistair, at the hotel she had built on the premise that change was possible. We're not breaking the cage, Mummies, she said finally. Alistair's grin widened. Oh, not yet. But we're going to make Heaven acknowledge it exists. Make them admit they built a prison and called it order. Charlie stood something hardening in her expression that hadn't been there 3 days ago. If they want to keep us contained, they're going to have to explain why. In terms that don't hide behind divine authority and population management. Vaggie recognized the look. She'd seen it before in meetings where Charlie's optimism collided with Hell's bureaucracy and emerged as something more dangerous than either. You're going political. I'm going honest. Charlie moved to the window, looking out at Pride Ring's contained infinity. They've been running extermination for centuries, calling it necessary, calling it justice. Fine. Let them justify the cage. Let them explain why redemption can't include the possibility of leaving. On the roof, Doomslayer resumed his work unconcerned with philosophical debates about freedom and containment. He had tested the barrier, confirmed it could be compromised given correct application of force and authorization, and cataloged that information for future tactical decisions. The cage existed. That was data. Whether it remained intact or not depended on whether Heaven's infrastructure continued interfering with his objective of ending systematic genocide. Everything else was political noise. Night fell over Pride Ring. And for the first time in Hell's documented history, its residents looked at the boundaries of their world and wondered if they had always been there, or if someone had drawn them when nobody was paying attention. The answer, as it turned out, was both. And somewhere in Heaven's administrative complex, Sarah was authorizing escalation protocols that would turn the next extermination into something far more comprehensive than population control. The cage had been tested. The keyhole had been found. Now came the question of whether Hell was willing to pay the price of opening the door. Charlie looked at the angelic weapons in the lobby, at the staff being trained for permanent solutions at the hotel that had transformed from Redemption Center to Fortress. She didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time since building the Hazbin Hotel, she was asking the right question. The cage was real. The question was whether living in it was worse than dying to escape it. Hell was about to find out. Heaven's administrative complex had existed for millennia without ever needing emergency protocols that didn't involve paperwork. The architecture reflected this confidence, all soaring columns and pristine white surfaces designed to inspire awe, not withstand assault. When the first alarm triggered, it took 17 minutes for anyone to determine whether it was a malfunction or an actual threat. By then, Doomslayer had already breached the outer perimeter. Sarah stood in the command sanctum, surrounded by displays showing telemetry that shouldn't exist. An unauthorized entity had crossed into Heaven's infrastructure. Not through the gates, not through approved channels, but by exploiting the same authorization signatures Heaven used to maintain extermination operations. "Explain this," she said, her voice carrying the precise tone of someone whose patience had limits, and they were rapidly approaching. The seraph assigned to security operations gestured helplessly at the screens. "He's using angelic weapons as access keys. The system recognizes the signatures, assumes authorized passage, and by the time it registers the contradiction, he's already through." Sarah's wings shifted in agitation. "So our entire containment architecture can be compromised by someone who simply carries the correct materials. The system was designed to prevent unauthorized exit from hell, not unauthorized entry into heaven. A distinction I'm sure will comfort us greatly when we're writing the incident report." Sarah pulled up tactical displays showing Heaven's armory district, where exorcist equipment was maintained between purge cycles. "What's his objective?" "Unknown, but his trajectory suggests he's targeting logistical infrastructure, not population centers." In the armory district, Doomslayer moved through spaces that had never been designed for actual defense. Heaven's weapon storage existed to service extermination operations, not to withstand someone who understood that eliminating the supply chain was more effective than fighting soldiers one at a time. The first vault opened when he pressed an angelic blade against the access panel. Divine authorization properly encoded, carried by someone the system couldn't classify as threat, because he existed outside Heaven's filing structure. The door unsealed with bureaucratic efficiency, revealing rows of Spear's armor components and equipment designed to make purging Hell's population as streamlined as possible. He set charges, not explosives, just systematic structural compromise to render the facility unusable. When the supports failed, the armory would collapse inward, removing months of operational capacity from Heaven's logistics. Exorcists arrived in formation wings, gleaming weapons drawn, moving with the practiced coordination of forces that had never lost a deployment. Their commander, Lute, recognized the situation with the kind of tactical clarity that came from actual combat experience, rather than administrative theory. "Surround and contain," she ordered. "Do not engage directly. Wait for—" Doomslayer didn't wait. Simply identified the formation's weak point and moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had broken better defensive positions before breakfast. The first 3 exorcists went down before their colleagues registered the attack. Not killed, but incapacitated with precise application of force to joints the armor didn't adequately protect. Lute adjusted immediately. "Aerial superiority. Get above him." They lifted wings, carrying them to advantageous positions in a space designed to accommodate their natural mobility. Doomslayer tracked their movement-calculated trajectories and brought down the nearest support column. The structure's collapse created a debris field that neutralized aerial advantage and forced combat into ranges where Heaven's doctrine became a liability rather than an asset. Lute fought, smart fought hard, used every tactical principle exorcists had developed over centuries of unopposed operations. It wasn't enough. She wasn't facing someone who fought by rules or respected formations or cared about the sanctity of Heaven's architecture. She was facing someone who treated sacred infrastructure like a tactical problem requiring direct solution. The armory's main vault detonated 30 seconds later. Not a massive explosion, just structural failure propagating through load-bearing points until the entire facility folded in on itself with the inevitability of mathematics applied to engineering. Months of supplies, years of accumulated equipment, the logistical foundation of extermination operations, all rendered into organized debris. Doomslayer walked out through the smoke, leaving Lute and her team scattered across a district that would require complete reconstruction before it could service another purge. In the command sanctum, Sarah watched the armory collapse. With the kind of calm that comes from recognizing you're witnessing a fundamental shift in how reality operates. Status on exorcist casualties. Minimal fatalities. Multiple incapacitations. Commander Loot is... The security seraph paused, requesting immediate backup and strategic reassessment, which we can't provide because our backup was in the armory he just destroyed. Sarah pulled up containment protocols designed for prison breaks and containment failures, not for this. Where is he now? Moving toward the gate nexus. The gate nexus, where Heaven maintained the portals used for extermination deployments, where the entire infrastructure of Pride Ring containment was coordinated and controlled. If he reached that, if he understood what he was looking at, deploy everything, Sarah said. Every available unit, every reserve. This is no longer a security incident. This is war doctrine. Back in Pride Ring, Charlie felt the moment shift, like atmospheric pressure changing before a storm. The exorcist patrols that had been circling at cautious altitude suddenly vectored away, recalled to Heaven with urgency that suggested panic rather than tactical repositioning. They're pulling back, Vaggi said, tracking the formations through the hotel's reinforced windows. All of them. Simultaneously, Alastor appeared in the lobby, his usual grin absent, replaced by something more subdued. How fascinating. Heaven is abandoning its containment posture. That suggests their attention is required elsewhere. He went up. Charlie said, not a question. Didn't he? Your resident catastrophe. Oh, yes. I imagine Heaven is having a rather unpleasant morning. Alastor's voice carried none of its usual amusement, though I suspect their afternoon will be considerably worse. At the gate nexus, Doomslayer encountered the full deployment Sarah had authorized. Exorcists, seraphim powers, every classification of Heaven's military hierarchy that hadn't been committed to other duties. They filled the space with divine light and coordinated formations, creating overlapping fields of fire that should have been impossible to penetrate. He studied the deployment for 3 seconds, identified the gate controls, calculated the most direct path. Then he moved. What followed wasn't a battle. Battles implied 2 sides, exchanging fire-testing defenses, seeking tactical advantage. This was systematic destruction of a defensive position by someone who understood that formations only worked when opponents respected their geometry. Heaven's forces adapted, adjusted, demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility that came from actual military tradition rather than bureaucratic procedure. They were skilled, experienced, coordinated. They had never fought someone who treated their sacred infrastructure like a demolition site, requiring careful application of force to critical points. The gate nexus didn't collapse like the armory. It simply stopped functioning when Doomslayer severed the conduits that connected Heaven's administrative will to Pride Ring's containment architecture. The portals flickered, failed, left Heaven without the ability to deploy extermination forces for the first time in recorded history. Sarah arrived to find her forces scattered and her infrastructure compromised by an entity that had accomplished in 1 hour what no force in hell had managed in millennia. She looked at Doomslayer across the ruined Nexus wings, spread in a display of authority that had always been sufficient before this moment. "Stand down," she commanded, voice carrying divine resonance that compelled obedience from entities bound by Heaven's hierarchy. Doomslayer's visor tracked her, registered her as another component of the system, found her equally irrelevant to the question of whether genocidal infrastructure should continue operating. He didn't stand down, simply resumed his trajectory toward the next objective, leaving Sarah to confront the reality that divine authority only worked on those who acknowledged its legitimacy. "This is war," she said to the assembled command structure, watching him disappear into Heaven's architectural maze. "Authorize escalation protocols, full mobilization. He's demonstrated that our containment systems are vulnerable. We respond by ensuring Hell understands the consequences of challenging Heaven's order." The command rippled through Heaven's hierarchy with the speed of bureaucracy finally recognizing it was too late for proper procedure. Across the realm, forces that had been held in reserve for emergencies that never materialized began activation sequences. In Pride Ring, the hotel stood fortified and armed, waiting for consequences that were no longer theoretical. Charlie looked at the weapons Carmilla had delivered at the staff, trained for permanent solutions at the fortress her dream of redemption had become. "He's not coming back, is he?" she asked. Vaggie checked the perimeter, watching for threats that would arrive with full heaven mobilization behind them. "Would you—" "He's probably found the next target." Alastor materialized between them, and for once his expression carried something approaching genuine concern. Heaven just learned that their monopoly on divine violence was contingent on Hell accepting the rules. Your guest has demonstrated that acceptance is optional. What happens now? Now? Alastor's voice dropped to something quieter. Now Hell learns whether it prefers the cage it knows or the war it just started. The night fell over Pride Ring darker than usual, as if the sky itself was bracing for impact. In the hotel, preparations continued for an escalation that had stopped being hypothetical the moment Doomslayer crossed into heaven and demonstrated that sacred infrastructure was just infrastructure with better marketing. Charlie stood at the window, looking at the barrier she now understood as a cage, and wondered if testing its locks had been worth the war that was coming. The answer, she suspected, wouldn't matter. The test had been made. The war was here. All that remained was surviving what came next. Heaven had received its first real war. Hell would receive the response shortly. And somewhere between the two, Doomslayer continued his work unconcerned with the philosophical implications of showing two eternal powers that their conflict had always been negotiable. They just hadn't met anyone willing to negotiate with violence before. Now they had. The rules were changing. The cage was breaking. And nobody was ready for what happened when eternal punishment met something that refused to be contained by divine architecture or infernal acceptance. The war had begun, and it was nothing like either side expected. Pride Ring had fallen into a waiting silence, the kind that precedes storms or revelations or the arrival of entities who rarely bother with formal announcements. The Exorcist patrols had vanished entirely after Heaven's infrastructure collapsed, leaving a vacuum that Hell's residents filled with nervous speculation and the kind of stillness that comes from recognizing you're standing at the edge of something larger than your understanding. Lucifer Morningstar arrived at the Hazbin Hotel without fanfare, which somehow made his presence more profound than any theatrical entrance could achieve. He simply appeared in the lobby, immaculate in his ringmaster's attire, looking like someone who had dressed for a performance but found himself at a funeral instead. Charlie saw him first, froze. "Dad?" "Charlotte?" His voice carried warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes, which were tracking the fortifications, the angelic weapons, the evidence of her hotel's transformation from redemption project to military installation. "We need to talk." Vaggie moved beside Charlie, spear in hand, but not raised. Understanding that threats meant nothing to someone who could erase the hotel from existence with less effort than it took to snap his fingers. Alastor materialized near the bar, his usual grin present, but subdued, recognizing he was witnessing a conversation that occurred on levels of power he could observe but not influence. Doomslayer descended from the third floor, his arrival announced by the sound of armored footsteps on stairs that had learned to accommodate his weight. He reached the lobby and stopped visor-tracking Lucifer with the same dispassionate assessment he applied to everything that moved. For 3 seconds they studied each other. Hell's ruler and the entity that had spent the last week dismantling both Heaven's infrastructure and Hell's equilibrium. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The assessment was being conducted in silence, through presence alone. Lucifer broke eye contact first, not from weakness, but from completion of whatever calculation he had been running. "Interesting. You really don't care, do you?" Doomslayer offered no response. Simply continued tracking Lucifer as a potential variable in ongoing tactical considerations. "Dad," Charlie said again, stepping forward despite Vaggie's hand on her shoulder. "What are you doing here?" "Damage control." Lucifer moved to the window, looking out at Pride Ring, with the weary familiarity of someone who had been managing disasters for longer than most civilizations had existed. Heaven just lost their primary extermination infrastructure. Hell's media network collapsed. Pride Ring's containment architecture was tested. And my daughter appears to be running a fortress instead of a hotel. He turned back to them. So yes, Charlotte, damage control. We didn't start this, Charlie said. No, but you've certainly contributed to its escalation. Lucifer's gaze moved to Doomslayer. By sheltering something that has no concept of the treaty's arrangements and carefully maintained fictions that keep heaven and hell from total war. Those fictions included annual genocide, Baggy said quietly. Yes, ugly, brutal, and preferable to the alternative. Lucifer's voice hardened. Extermination was population control disguised as justice. War is what happens when both sides stop pretending there are rules. Charlie felt something crack in her chest. So we should have let it continue. Let heaven kill us on schedule because the alternative is inconvenient. I didn't say that. Lucifer's expression softened marginally. I said you forced my hand. Hell has existed in a state of managed punishment for millennia. Stable, predictable, survivable for those who understood the system. Now that system is breaking, and I need to know if you understand what you're defending. He moved closer to Doomslayer, not threateningly, but with the kind of presence that usually made reality bend around him. You're not from hell, not from heaven, not part of any hierarchy I recognize. So tell me, what exactly are you fighting for? Doomslayer's visor tracked Lucifer's movement, registered the question, provided no answer. Of course. Lucifer turned back to Charlie. He's not fighting for anything. He's fighting against systems that kill, against infrastructure that enables genocide. It's pure in its way, uncomplicated. He paused. And absolutely catastrophic for anyone trying to maintain civilization around him. Is that what hell is? Charlie's voice carried an edge she rarely allowed. Civilization? We're a cage, Dad. A filing system for souls heaven doesn't want to deal with. That's not civilization. That's just organized cruelty with better paperwork. It's survival. Lucifer's wings manifested not as threat, but as emphasis, filling the lobby with presence that made breathing feel like a privilege. Heaven has the power to scour hell from existence. They don't, because we maintain the illusion that punishment has structure, that there's order, that containment serves a purpose. He looked at each of them in turn. The moment we prove we can challenge their authority, we become a problem requiring permanent solution. They already think that, Baggy said. The moment she gestured at Doomslayer, killed the first angel, permanently we crossed that line. No, that was provocation. Lucifer gestured at the fortified hotel, at the weapons, at the evidence of systematic resistance, his declaration. You're not just defending yourselves anymore. You're demonstrating that hell can fight back. Charlie felt the weight of every decision she'd made since Doomslayer walked through her door. The weapons from Carmilla, the training, the choice not to reject violence when it arrived wearing the face of extinction. What would you have done differently? The question hung in the air, and Lucifer's expression shifted to something that might have been pride if it weren't so deeply exhausted. I would have done exactly what you did. Which is why I'm here. He moved to the center of the lobby, and when he spoke, his voice carried resonance that made the building's foundations remember they existed at his sufferance. Hell is my domain, mine, not heaven's playground, not their dumping ground, not their convenient solution to the problem of souls that don't fit their narrative. His gaze fixed on Doomslayer. You brought war to my territory. Fine, you want to dismantle heaven's infrastructure, I won't stop you. But understand this. Lucifer's presence expanded, filling the space with power that made angelic weapons look like children's toys, and divine authority feel like a suggestion from someone who hadn't read the room. Hell will not be collateral. You fight your war. You tear down heaven's mechanisms. You do whatever it is you do. But my people are not ammunition. Pride Ring is not your battlefield unless I allow it. Doomslayer's visor tracked this display of power with the same analytical distance he had shown everything else. Lucifer represented significant force, capable of interfering with objectives if he chose to. That made him a variable, requiring assessment, not a threat requiring immediate removal. The calculation was visible in his posture, the slight shift of weight that indicated readiness without aggression. Lucifer recognized it for what it was, and actually smiled, though the expression carried no warmth. "Good," Lucifer said. "You understand boundaries. That's more sophisticated than I expected." He turned back to Charlie. "Your hotel can continue to exist. Your residents can train with those weapons Carmilla sold you. You can prepare for whatever heaven sends next. But," and his voice hardened again, "you do it knowing I'm watching, knowing that the moment hell becomes more damaged by this war than it was by extermination, I will end it. Decisively." "How?" Vaggie asked the tactical question, cutting through the philosophical weight. Lucifer's smile turned genuinely amused for the first time. "By giving heaven what they really want. Not victory, agreement. The one thing they fear more than losing is that I might decide cooperation serves hell's interests better than resistance." He let that sink in. "I have been ruling hell longer than most of you have existed. I know how to negotiate with powers that think themselves absolute." Charlie felt cold. "You'd side with heaven. I'd end a war that threatens my domain. Whether that means supporting you or supporting them depends entirely on which option preserves hell." Lucifer moved toward the door, his presence already diminishing as he prepared to leave. "I didn't build this place to watch it burn in someone else's crusade." He paused at the threshold, looking back at Doomslayer one final time. "You're probably going back to heaven, going to finish whatever you started with their infrastructure. I won't stop you. But know this, every action you take up there, hell pays for down here. Keep the casualties contained to those who signed up for this fight." Doomslayer offered no acknowledgement, simply registered the boundary condition and filed it with other tactical constraints that affected operational planning. Lucifer nodded, as if that non-response was exactly what he'd expected. Then he looked at Charlie, and something in his expression softened. "I'm proud of you. For what it's worth, you saw a system that wasn't working and tried to change it. That takes courage." He paused. "Just make sure your courage doesn't cost more than hell can afford to pay." Then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of sulfur and authority that lingered in spaces he had occupied. The lobby settled into silence. Charlie stared at the door, processing implications that felt heavier than any weight Carmilla's weapons could generate. Vaggie lowered her spear, understanding they had just witnessed something that couldn't be fought with steel, angelic or otherwise. Alastair was the first to speak, his voice carrying genuine respect. "Well, that was educational." "He threatened us," Charlie said quietly. "He established parameters," Vaggie corrected. "There's a difference. He's not saying we can't fight. He's saying we can't let hell burn while we do it. And if heaven decides hell needs to burn, then he picks a side." Vaggie moved to the window, watching the space where Lucifer had departed. "The question is which one?" Doomslayer returned to his work on the upper floors. The conversation already filed as completed tactical briefing. Lucifer represented power sufficient to interfere with objectives, but had chosen not to. The constraint was noted. The work continued. Charlie sank into one of the lobby chairs, feeling the weight of divine politics pressing down from both directions. I thought if we could just prove that change was possible, that redemption could work, everything would get better. It still might sound awesome, Vaggie said, though her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who understood. Optimism required significant structural support to remain standing. But it's going to get a lot worse first. Night fell over Pride Ring. And for the first time since extermination began, the streets felt genuinely unsafe in a new way. Not because of angels descending from heaven, but because hell itself was shifting, recalibrating, trying to understand what it meant that its ruler had drawn a line in the sand, and the war was continuing anyway. In the hotel, preparations continued. Weapons were maintained, defenses were checked. Staff trained for conflicts that kept escalating beyond anyone's initial projections. The Hazbin Hotel had become a fortress, not because anyone planned it that way, but because survival demanded infrastructure that philosophy couldn't provide alone. Charlie sat in her office, looking at maps of hell she'd never really examined before. The rings, the hierarchies, the carefully maintained boundaries that kept one form of suffering separated from another. Her father ruled all of it, maintained all of it, and was now willing to sacrifice any of it to preserve the whole, including her hotel if necessary. The realization felt like growing up, which was unfortunate because she'd been hoping to avoid that particular trauma indefinitely. Somewhere above, Doomslayer checked sightlines and calculated firing angles, preparing for Heaven's response to having their gate infrastructure destroyed. Lucifer's warning changed nothing about the tactical situation. Heaven would come, Pride Ring would defend, the war would continue. The only question was whether hell would survive it intact, or whether Lucifer would decide that peace with heaven cost less than victory alongside something that wouldn't negotiate. Charlie didn't have the answer. Wasn't sure anyone did. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Lucifer had given them permission to continue with conditions attached. They could fight. They could resist. They could prove that hell didn't have to accept heaven's rules. They just had to do it without burning down the kingdom her father had spent millennia building from the ashes of his own failed rebellion. No pressure. She returned to the lobby to find Vaggie organizing the next shift of perimeter watch. Found herself moving to help because if they were going to navigate between heaven's war and Lucifer's boundaries, they'd need more than hope. They'd need precision. The hotel stood fortified, armed, and now explicitly conditional on its ability to protect hell while fighting heaven. The margin for error had just become very, very small. And somewhere in heaven's administrative complex, Sarah was learning that Lucifer had drawn a line, which meant the war had just acquired rules neither side had planned for. The game had changed again, and this time, nobody knew what victory looked like anymore. 3 weeks after heaven's infrastructure fell silent, Pride Ring settled into a new rhythm that felt less like peace and more like holding your breath underwater. The Exorcist patrols had stopped entirely, not because heaven had surrendered, but because they no longer had the gate nexus to deploy through. Somewhere in their pristine administrative complex, Seraphim were recalculating centuries of doctrine around the uncomfortable reality that their monopoly on divine violence had been permanently interrupted. Charlie stood at the hotel's repaired window the third time they'd replaced the glass, watching sinners move through streets that hadn't seen angelic purge in longer than anyone remembered. They walked differently now, not safer, but aware. Like people who had learned that absence of threat wasn't the same as security. The sign above the entrance still read, "Hazbin Hotel," in neon that flickered more than it used to. Below it, smaller letters spelled out, "Every sinner has a future." Someone's stray spell had cracked the last word during a skirmish 2 weeks back. Charlie kept meaning to fix it, kept not finding the time. Vaggie found her there, carrying coffee that had become their unofficial morning ritual. Carmilla sent another invoice. She's calling it extended security consultation fees. Translation, we're still buying weapons we hoped we'd never need. Need is a flexible concept. Vaggie set down the coffee, her gaze tracking the same streets Charlie was watching. But yes, we're still buying. The hotel had changed in ways that went beyond fortification. The lobby still held furniture, still maintained the aesthetic of somewhere people might want to stay. But every arrangement now served dual purpose. The reading nook provided cover for the eastern entrance. The piano Angel Dust's idea blocked a sightline that Vaggie had flagged as vulnerable. Redemption and tactical defense coexisting in the same space because they had to. Husk emerged from the bar bottle in hand, looking marginally less exhausted than he had a month ago. Supply run. We need more of that angelic steel polish. Apparently leaving divine weapons to corrode is bad for structural integrity. Add it to the list, Vaggie said. The list is getting long. So is the future we're trying to build. Husk grunted, which was about as close to agreement as he got these days, and returned to inventory management that now included categorizing weapons by divine resonance frequency. Upstairs, Doomslayer maintained his position on the roof. Not because the hotel needed defending at this exact moment, but because the war hadn't ended, merely shifted into a holding pattern, while both sides recalculated what victory looked like when the rules had been fundamentally rewritten. He had been offered quarters, a room, recognition as something other than a tactical asset. He'd ignored the offers with the same silence he applied to everything, simply continuing his work of turning the hotel into something that could withstand whatever came next. Charlie had stopped trying to understand whether he was staying to protect them or staying because heaven remained a target requiring systematic dismantling. Perhaps the distinction didn't matter. Alastor materialized in the lobby with less fanfare than usual. His presence announced by static that felt thinner these days. His grin remained, but it had acquired edges that suggested genuine uncertainty rather than theatrical menace. Morning, my dear. Still contemplating the philosophical implications of operating a rehabilitation center with an armory in the basement. The armory is on the second floor, Charlie corrected automatically. Ah, yes. Forgive my error. So much easier to access from the guest rooms that way. Charlie turned from the window, studying Alastor with the kind of attention she'd learned to apply to entities whose motivations remained deliberately opaque. You've been quiet lately. Observation requires silence. I'm simply taking notes on Hell's first experiment with armed neutrality. His grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Though I suspect neutral is a generous description for a hotel that houses something heaven can't kill and won't forgive. He's still just one person. He's a precedent, Alastor corrected. The first proof that heaven's order is negotiable. That makes him considerably more dangerous than mere firepower would suggest. He paused. I assume you've noticed Hell's other overlords have been observant. Charlie had noticed. The power vacuum left by the V's collapse had been filled but cautiously with players who remembered what happened to those who became too visible. Hell's political landscape had shifted from open exploitation to careful maneuvering. Everyone aware that the game had new rules and nobody was entirely sure what they were yet. Vaggie's radio crackled. Carmilla's voice, professional as ever. Package delivery, standard protocols. Copy, Vaggie replied, then to Charlie. Another shipment. She's been consistent, I'll give her that. Consistent about arming us for a war that might not come. Might not come soon, Vaggie corrected. But it's coming. Heaven doesn't just accept this kind of disruption. They're planning something. We just don't know what yet. The delivery arrived in unmarked crates that clinked with familiar weight. Angel Dust helped unload with the resigned efficiency of someone who had stopped questioning how his afterlife had become military logistics. Nifty cataloged inventory with disturbing cheerfulness, treating angelic weapons like cleaning supplies that required proper organization. In Heaven's administrative complex, Sarah reviewed reports that would never be made public. Casualties. Infrastructure damage. The complete revision of extermination doctrine required when your primary deployment mechanism had been systematically destroyed by an entity that shouldn't exist according to any theological framework they possessed. Status on containment architecture, she asked. Pride ring barrier is stable, but monitored, her aide replied carefully. Lucifer Morningstar has been personally reinforcing the boundaries. He's made it clear any attempt to breach will be treated as direct assault on Hell's sovereignty. He's protecting them. He's protecting his territory. There's a distinction. Sarah studied telemetry showing Pride Ring's altered state. Hell hadn't become virtuous. It had become aware. Sinners armed with angelic weapons trained for permanent solutions, operating under the protection of an overlord who had finally decided his domain was worth defending. And at the center of it all, the hotel that had somehow become both symbol and fortress. The anomaly, ma'am, she said. Current location. Still at the hotel. Hasn't left in 18 days. So it can be patient. Or it's waiting for something. The distinction felt important, though. Sarah wasn't sure why. An entity capable of destroying heaven's infrastructure with methodical precision, now simply waiting. Not threatening. Not negotiating. Just existing in a space that had become untouchable because Lucifer had drawn a line and heaven couldn't afford to cross it without triggering total war. Maintain observation protocols, Sarah ordered, and begin preliminary work on alternative containment strategies. If Pride Ring's barrier can be tested, it can be compromised. I want contingencies. Back at the hotel, Charlie sat in her office surrounded by paperwork that documented the mundane realities of running a fortress disguised as a rehabilitation center. Budgets, supply chains, training schedules, insurance policies that technically covered acts of divine warfare because Hell's bureaucracy adapted faster than its theology. A knock. Vaggie entered without waiting for permission, because they'd long since dispensed with formalities that wasted time. Lucifer sent a message. Charlie's stomach tightened. What did he say? Stability maintained. Continue current operations. Report any escalation immediately. Vaggie set down the communication crystal. He's treating us like a military installation. We kind of are one. Doesn't mean I have to like it. Vaggie sat down. Exhaustion finally catching up with someone who had been in some form of combat for longer than she wanted to calculate. Charlie, I need to know. If this keeps going, if we're stuck in this permanent almost war, is it still worth it? The question deserved more than Charlie's immediate instinct to say yes. She looked at the maps, the manifests, the evidence of a hotel that had survived by becoming something other than what she'd planned. Ask me when we actually save someone. When redemption happens, despite all this. Then I'll know if it was worth it. And if it doesn't, then we'll have proven you can survive Hell without accepting its rules. That's something. Night fell over Pride Ring. And for the 72nd consecutive evening, no angels descended to purge the population. The sinners had started celebrating, at first treating it like victory. Now they just existed in a hell that was no less eternal, but slightly less predictably lethal. On the roof, Doomslayer maintained his vigil. Heaven remained a target. The infrastructure that enabled genocide still existed, merely damaged rather than destroyed. The work was incomplete. Therefore, he remained. Charlie found him there as the sky darkened to its evening shade of crimson. Didn't try to speak to him, she'd learned that lesson. Just stood nearby, looking out at the same city he was protecting or preparing to abandon, or simply monitoring according to calculations she would never fully understand. I don't know if you're a blessing or a curse, she said to the silence. But thank you for what it's worth. Doomslayer's visor tracked her acknowledgement, registered it as a communication requiring no response, and returned to scanning for threats that would eventually materialize, because Heaven never truly accepted disruption of their order. Charlie went back downstairs to find Vaggie organizing the night watch and Alastair providing commentary that helped nobody but entertained him. Found herself smiling despite everything because the hotel was still standing, her people were still alive, and Hell had learned that eternity could be interrupted if you were willing to pay the price. The price had been high, would probably get higher. But they'd paid it together, and somehow that made the debt more bearable. The sign outside flickered in the dark. Its broken word a reminder that futures remain possible, even when they arrived damaged. The hotel stood fortified and scarred, no longer a symbol of naive hope, but something more durable proof that change could survive contact with reality if you were willing to compromise everything except the core belief that drove you. Somewhere in the building, Doomslayer continued his work. Somewhere in heaven, Sarah planned contingencies for a problem that wouldn't be solved cleanly. Somewhere in Hell's deeper rings, Lucifer maintained boundaries that would hold only as long as he chose to enforce them. And in the lobby of the Hazbin Hotel, Charlie Morningstar looked at the weapons mounted beside the welcome desk and understood that redemption had never been about being pure. It was about being strong enough to survive the compromises required to keep trying. The war hadn't ended. It had learned to wait. And in that waiting, Hell had discovered something it hadn't possessed before. The capacity to choose. Not freedom, not yet, maybe not ever, but choice, and that was worth defending. Even if the defense looked nothing like the dream she'd started with. The hotel lights stayed on through the night, burning against Hell's darkness, like a statement that refused to be extinguished. Not victory, not peace, just stubborn, damaged, complicated survival. It would have to be enough. For now, the Hazbin Hotel universe represents chaos itself. That is precisely why Charlie the Princess of Hell founded the hotel, with the goal of rehabilitating sinners and helping them ascend to heaven. However, when a being far stronger than the system itself appears, everything is thrown into disorder. Doomslayer falls into the pride ring at the exact moment heaven is carrying out an extermination. Shortly after, exorcists are killed permanently, marking the first time in history that heaven suffers real losses. Suddenly gaining an overwhelmingly powerful ally, Charlie allows Doomslayer to stay at the Hazbin Hotel, and the building effectively becomes a defensive fortress against heaven's purges. Although heaven is forced to retreat temporarily in the face of Doomslayer's overwhelming strength, true peace is unlikely. No one knows when heaven will return. It may be sooner than anyone expects.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss out future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.